Scripture this morning is from Esther, selections of chapter 3 and 6. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor, higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore, they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found, recorded there, that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now, Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, "Haman is standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Now, Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with the royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, then lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." This is God's word.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning. Thank you for being here, whether in person or online. Last week we started looking at this unique story of Esther. It's part of our ongoing immersion since post-Labor Day to look at the larger story of the Bible. And I recognize that maybe for some of you who are just kind of kicking the tires of Christianity, didn't grow up in the church, the Bible is just this kind of big, thick book that's been more of a mystery. But let me assure you that for people who did grow up in the church, oftentimes it's just as mysterious and can feel like a disconnected compilation of history and prophecy and poetry. And so one of the reasons that we're immersing ourselves in these various stories is to remind us that they're not a disconnected compilation of history and prophecy and poetry, that are actually one large story that answers the questions that humans have been asking ever since they've been asking questions. Who am I, and why am I here? And what's wrong with the world? Why are bombs going off in Ukraine? And is there any hope for what ails us? Is the things that we were singing about at Christmas, peace on earth, is that just a fairy tale, or is it actually possible? These are the questions that have haunted humanity down through the years, and the Bible, in this one large story, gives us the answers to all of those questions. And it's a reminder that the stories of Esther and Abraham and Ruth and Isaiah and the Proverbs are all connected and point to and find their fulfillment and meaning in the person and the story of Jesus. So when you read the story of Esther, you have to ultimately say, how does this help me understand Jesus? And so the reason that we've been doing this is because of the tendency for spiritual amnesia and the unconscious ways in which throughout the week we are drawn out of the story of God and into the story of the world. And the world in the biblical landscape is a way of being and thinking that denies the existence of God, or sees God as irrelevant, or sees God actually as an obstacle to the good life, to a life of happiness and joy. That God actually gets in the way, is the enemy of the answer to those kinds of questions. And so Esther, and I encouraged you to do this last week, is to read the whole story from beginning to end. It's a brilliant story of a cautionary tale of the danger of getting drawn out of the story of God into the story of the world. For example, just one literary device. You'll notice that the author and the early readers would have known that Xerxes, the king, would have suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Greeks shortly after this story was written. And the author and the readers would have known that Haman, the villain, was going to suffer a humiliating death at the hands of Mordecai. And yet in the opening chapter of the story of Esther, we don't get to Esther or Mordecai until chapter 2. Why? Why would the author celebrate this 6-month party that celebrated wealth and power and status and sex as the beginning of a story when he knew that it was going to end the other way? Because it's a reminder that when we leave here and we start our weeks, we can easily get drawn into chapter 1 and forget chapter 2. And that the danger of this first chapter is the self-destructive nature of pride that we find this week in Haman. That's the first point. We're going to look at Haman's pride. And the story offers an alternative to that kind of life. An alternative to, last week we looked at the 2 banquets. Today we're going to look at these 2 individuals, of the redemptive presence of Mordecai. So I just want to look at those 2 things, Haman's pride and the presence of Mordecai. And so let's do that now. First, Haman's pride, because this is a big part of the story. Now, we hadn't met Haman until chapter 3, and evidently in the tradition of our Jewish neighbors who celebrate Purim, which is part of the book of Esther, the children have the role of hissing every time Haman's name is mentioned. He's such a villain, right? Because he wants to wipe out the Jews. He's like Voldemort in the story, or Thanos, right? And what we find in chapter 3 is that he has been given the highest honor in the kingdom, second only to the king. He's the prime minister. He's been given the robe of the king, which we'll get back to later. Now, you would think that kind of promotion would satisfy the egos of most people. But the first hint we get at the danger of the pride of Haman is his response to the fact that this kind of peasant Jew who sits on the corner, who's in exile, who has no status, won't bow down to him. And he's not just annoyed. The Greek there says he's enraged, which is the visual of a volcano going off. So here's this guy with all this power and all this prestige, and the king himself has given him this honor, and because this one guy won't bow down, he goes crazy, such that he doesn't want to just kill Mordecai. He wants to do a genocide. He wants to wipe out thousands of Jews across the Persian Empire. So all of a sudden we see that there is some kind of, one commentator says, the aroma of death has entered the story through the pride of Haman. And it's not just going to be ultimately his death. That's the self-destructive nature of pride. But he has brought this death into the story because if you refuse to bow down to me, you have been disqualified from life in this world. You don't deserve existence. I'm going to kill you and everyone like you because I need everyone to bow down to me. Now, what is that? That is the power of pride in someone's life. I won't go into a lot of detail, but there is, you can find this online. The former president of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, some of you know, he was awarded in 1991 in Sweden, was given an award. He gave a speech on the political dangers of power. And I'll just read what he said because it struck me that it is so much like Haman and frankly so much like us because it isn't just politics. We can get all kinds of hits off power in all kinds of ways, right? But he writes, there's something dangerous and delusive and ambiguous in the temptation of power. On the one hand, political power gives you this wonderful opportunity to confirm day in and day out that you really exist, that you have your own undeniable identity, that with every word and deed, you're leaving a highly visible mark on the world around you, right? That is, every human being wants to do that, right? But he goes on to say, within that same political power, and in everything that logically belongs to it, right? You get to be led around on a horse, you get people to bow down to you. He talks about that he never has to go out for a haircut, right? Everybody comes to him, right? Within that same political power, and everything that belongs to it is a terrible danger. Think about this with Haman. That while pretending to confirm our existence and our identity, that kind of power will rob us of both. In other words, it dehumanizes you over time. You become less and less human, even though the temptation is the king has given me a robe and I am one of the greatest humans in the world. But what we see here, as death has entered the story, that he's on a path of self-destruction. One commentator said, Haman is pictured as a proud person who constantly desired human praise. In short, he was just hungry for power. Now, we'll get back to that, but I just want to unpack briefly the essence and the way pride works. And many of you have heard this, but it's really hard to get into your lives. And it's ubiquitous, as I'll show you, in every part of our lives. And the point is, the way pride works is that it wasn't enough for him, right, to get the promotion. It wasn't enough to have all this access to power and wealth. You had to bow down to him. In other words, what pride does is whatever happens in your life is a means to a greater end, which is the approval of other people. So if humility is self-forgetfulness, pride is self-obsessiveness. And you see the way this works in your life, right? It's the gateway sin to all the other sins. It goes back to Satan himself. And it ultimately, and this is the danger of pride, and you can tease it out, right? It isolates us from one another because we look down on them, so you have to bow down to me. Somehow I'm greater than you are, so that creates barriers. But it also creates an injustice in the world because you can begin to justify hating or dismissing other people, which in Haman's case was an anti-Semitism that was going to lead to a Holocaust. So there's isolation relationally. It creates walls between us. And communally, it brings injustice in the world because we are justifying ourselves and we have to demonize and cannibalize other people to build ourselves up. This is why it is the gateway sin to all other sins. This is what Satan did, right? He looked God in the eye and said, I'm not going to bow down to you. It is the essence of all sin. C.S. Lewis, in his famous chapter on pride in the book Mere Christianity, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only having more of it than the next person. It wasn't enough to be the prime minister. They had to bow down. So pride takes no pleasure in being wealthy or beautiful or successful, because once you're in the presence of somebody who's equally or more beautiful or more successful or more wealthy, your wealth and your beauty and your success loses all joy. Why? Because the only joy you got out of it was that you had more of it than other people. This is why it is a self-destructive thing. And it's why Haman needs everyone from the queen all the way down to a peasant on the side of the road to bow down to him. Because it wasn't enough that he had the robes king. It wasn't enough that he had all the power. He needed everybody to recognize him as superior. See, this is the great lie that you can actually affirm yourself into peace, right? Yes, of course, you have to love yourself. You have to do all those things. Those are all important things. But ultimately, what we need is affirmation from other people to feel good about ourselves, to have some sense of peace in our lives. And of course, the ubiquitous danger of pride is that it can attach itself to anything. It's like a virus. So if you attach it to your race, it creates what? Racism. If you attach it to your wealth, it creates elitism. If you attach it to your politics, it creates nationalism. If you attach it to your religion, which is the worst kind of ism, it creates moralism. Because what is greater than weaponizing truth, divine truth? We know God. God is on our side. There's nothing more isolating and dehumanizing to other people than that kind of pride. And all of them, right, thinking about our vision, creates barriers between us and our neighbors. And so this is where the hard work begins, because what I did this week is to say, okay, the principles of pride are maybe familiar, but finding them in your own life is really hard because they pop up in all of the debilitating emotions that we experience every week. And so just some of the ones that I wrote down this week for me was bitterness, which is fueled by pride, and you can't forgive somebody. Some of you are bitter right now in your life, the root of which is pride, because at the core of your bitterness is what? I would never do that to somebody. There's a superiority, and it creates bitterness, which is a dehumanizing characteristic, or worry or impatience stem from a form of pride that says, if I was in charge of the world, things would be different. We can't handle the circumstances over which we have no control, and what we want is control. And if we knew that if we were in charge, we wouldn't be impatient or worried. Or joylessness, right? A sense of numbness in your life, and you can't celebrate when a friend gets engaged or promoted because there's this inner whisper of pride that says, well, I'm more attractive and more successful. I should be engaged. I should have that kind of job. It's so subtle, but it robs you of joy and creates separation in friendships, and it dehumanizes. Or boredom or cynicism, which stems from the fact of, Tom Wolfe, Bonfire of the Vanities, that we are the masters of our own destiny, and that I got this job because I went to the right school and I had all these connections, but I still did all this work. And it's a form of pride that ignores the fact that every good gift in your life, every good thing in your life is a gift. Every heartbeat you have is a gift of God. Everything that's happened to you is a gift. And without that kind of humility and gratitude, you will be cynical and bored. See, these are just my crap. I think this is 2 sermons in a row I used the word crap. Somebody mentioned it last week. Apologies. It's G-rated compared to the stuff I hear in my home. But the attitude, right, the antidote to the is humility, is gratitude. And so we can see why in Haman, what does pride ultimately do in all those dehumanizing things? It distorts our view of ourselves. It creates a foolishness in us in which we think everybody should see us the way we see ourselves. So Haman walks into the king, and he's hell-bent on getting Mordecai killed. But as soon as the king has a different agenda about honoring somebody, his pride is such that, he must be talking about me because I'm the greatest person in the kingdom. Who else could he possibly be talking? It completely distorts his view. He doesn't even consider that there could be anybody else in the kingdom who the king takes delight in other than him. And that foolishness, the cautionary tale, is what will ultimately lead to the humiliation of having to lead Mordecai around the kingdom as a servant of the person he hates. And ultimately, he will hang on the same gallows that he built for Mordecai. Do you see how brilliant this story is? And how you need to sit with it? And how pride does become before a fall? Now, this is kind of a fire hose version of understanding pride. And the due diligence comes when you have to, this week or in some form, pay attention to your own emotional life, your own bitterness, your own boredom, your own worry, your own fear, whatever it is, and take those breadcrumbs and follow it back, and you will find pride. You'll find pride. And the source of it, and I'll just end with this before we go to the second one, is ultimately it comes from a deep sense of what? Insecurity. From this need that we have. And again, the author gives us the hint brilliantly when he describes Haman as a what? Verse 1, an Agagite. Now that seems inconsequential, but anytime somebody in the biblical literature is described, it gives us a hint of their place in the larger story. So what is an Agagite? Agag was the king of the Amalekites, and the Amalekites went to war with King Saul. And guess who was a descendant of Saul? Mordecai. And so right away you begin to see that these are going to be the antagonists in the story. There's going to be a battle between Mordecai and Haman. But more than that, the Amalekites were the first tribe that tried to wipe out the Jews post-Exodus on their way to the Promised Land. They were trying to create a Holocaust for the Jews. And here is Agagite, the Agagite, and he's now in this story. And the reason we're told in Deuteronomy that the king of the Amalekites wanted to wipe out the Jews is because of this. Their king did not fear God. They didn't fear God. A fool says in their heart, there is no God. I don't need God for my life. I can find the good life without him. And Psalm 10 puts it this way, in his pride, the wicked does not seek God. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. You see, this is the tragic lie that we all believe, that we don't need God. There's no room for God in my life when I'm trying to make it in a place like New York. I have room for God on Sundays. I have room for God in my community group, but I do not have room for God in the boardroom or in the classroom or on the trading floor. I don't need it. But the deep dislocation, the pre-existing condition is that we need people to bow down to us. If we reject God as the source of our identity, we will look for it in someplace else. And just one last quote here. This is from Ernest Becker, The Denial of Death. We don't want to admit that we don't stand alone, that we always rely on something that transcends us, some system of ideas, powers in which we're embedded and which support us, that keep a person ignorant of himself, right? That's the distortion, that's the foolishness. That we don't rest on our own center, that we draw our courage to be from a God, sexual context, conquest, big brother, or the flag, the proletariat, or the fetish of money, or the size of a bank balance, or the bow of a lonely Jewish exile on the street corner of Persia. See, that is the lie, that we are independent, but we need something. And so the healthiest thing that we do every week in worship, and I don't think there's any other part of your life in New York City this happens, we gather together with hundreds of people and we say out loud, what? I'm Haman. And people should hiss, right? What did we pray this morning? I have done evil in your sight. See, it's confession when you say out loud so that I can hear that, and I say out loud so that you can hear that, that is the ultimate antidote to this. Because it humbles us and gives us a sense of forgiveness. And if we can push past, because I know in my own heart, I resist that idea that I'm like Haman. I resist in my heart that I'm that bad. But unless I can, in the silence of confession, push past that resistance, then there's hope for not just forgiveness, but the gratitude that will break down the barriers that will allow you to look to people around you and begin to love your neighbor and find points of healing for them. But without that, if we hold on to the pride, if we resist the fact that we're like Haman, it will never happen. We won't become agents of redemption, which is the second point. So do your due diligence, follow the emotions back to the breadcrumb of pride, and think about ways in which you can overcome the resistance that you're like Haman and begin to transition from Haman to Mordecai, which is the second point. Okay, so the presence of Mordecai, which is as opposed to the destructive, redemptive. Now, what do I mean by that? Quickly. Mordecai comes from the royal line of Saul. He comes from the story of God. He represents an alternative way of being human in this story. Both Mordecai and Esther do that. And the alternative, right, for the people of God was to be a light to the nations, a light to the Hamans, a light to the Persians, to the Babylonians. Equivalent to what Jesus said in his kind of coming out party, in his Sermon on the Mount, in which he laid down his platform for his kingship, that people who are going to follow his sacred call are to be salt and light in the world. And so that is what Mordecai represents, that he is salt and light in that place. And he's portrayed as someone, and this is the title of the sermon, who is faithful, right, in that he will not bow down, which, as you read the story, is part of his Jewish heritage and part of his faith in who God is. So he won't bow down to Haman, but he's also present. He's in the public square. We saw last week, and we'll see again next week, Mordecai is an agent for justice and peace in Persia, even though they have no interest in his faith. So a Christian is to be someone, and this is a term that was coined, as we'll see in a minute, by James Hunter down at UVA, to be faithfully present, to be proximate, to be orthodox, and to hold on to the faith that you have and the beliefs you have, but actually be present and bring love and healing to your neighbors. Now that just biblically is God's command to the exiles, of which Mordecai was part, right? Jeremiah 29, a seminal text for Redeemer's existence. The false prophets were saying, yes, you're going to be taken into Babylon. But the false prophets were saying, don't worry, it's not going to be long. Just live outside of the city. Don't go into the city. God's going to take care of it. But then God, through Jeremiah, said, no. You guys are going to be there 70 years. Leave the suburbs and move downtown. Get out of your bubble. Build homes. Have families. Get jobs. Get proximate to these people who hate you, who disagree with you, who may, because you don't bow down, will eliminate you. And it's a reminder that I know for me growing up, and for a lot of people growing up, people look at a place like New York City, they look at it like Babylon. They kind of hold their nose and tolerate it while they're here, so they build up their resume and get their bona fides, but then they'll find their real home with a backyard and people who look like them, something that's more familiar. But the whole point of being faithfully present is to go to places where people don't necessarily agree, and to be light and to be salt in those places. And I was thinking about it this week, there was a real intention when we changed our vision statement a year and a half ago. Because how do we rethink that idea in a post-pandemic New York City, where there is so much kind of confusion and disorientation about life? And so this idea to be faithful, right? This sacred call to follow Jesus is to be a disciple, which is to shape your life to his life. It is to take seriously the Sermon on the Mount and to live out of his ethics, which is really hard. But to the degree that that happens, we can love our neighbors and bring healing to our city, to be faithfully present in the city. And that's why we started support groups this week. That's why we have art openings. That's why we go to the Frederick Douglass houses every other week. Once a month, we go to the All Angels. We have all kinds of opportunities for people to use this space and spaces outside of here to be a place where our neighbors can come and experience love and healing. And it's particularly important given how much the culture has shifted since Redeemer started back in the late 80s. It's radically different just in those 35 years, right? For years, if you went to church in places like America, in the West, there was just an assumption that we all lived in a culture that was fueled by the kind of the Judeo-Christian work ethic. And so churches just mainly had to worship, evangelize, and disciple, but didn't really have to shape how you thought about what happened in the arts and economics and finance and law and parenting. Because there was the fuel of Christendom. Even if people didn't believe it, there was an ethos that the reality and the morality of the world was shaped by that. Well, that has been gone for a while. And so what it means is that churches have to expand their ideas of formation and discipleship and challenge people to be thoughtful and proactive about taking the cautionary tale of Esther and say, how do I be faithfully present in my job? And how do I grow as someone in these places of influence where people may never show up on church on Sunday, but I am set into, as James Hunter said, change the world. Because that's what Christians are called to do. Now, Hunter in his book, in which he said change the world, Christians have done 3 ways that have all been flawed in the past. The first is to be defensive against culture and seek to dominate it. Right? We just got to get Christians on the court and elected into government, and we can write the laws, and the culture will change. I think we can pretty much see that that ship has sailed, and it's actually not a very, effective way of changing people's hearts and minds. But secondly, he says seeking purity from the culture and withdraw from it entirely. Right? We have our Christian bubble. Now that's being faithful, but it's not being present. Or you can just assimilate into the culture so you can be present but not faithful. So that's why he says there is this alternative that Jesus calls salt and light, in which we're proximate and we seek to serve our neighbors. And so the church needs to be a place that begins to think about that, because there is a cultural economy in every vocation that you are involved in, from parenting to finance, that reflects a certain morality. And it is no longer primarily shaped by a view of the world that was shaped by the Judeo-Christian ethic. So what does that mean? One quote here from Leslie Newbegin, who was a missionary in India and had all kinds of insights when he came back to Britain. We need to create possibilities in every congregation for lay people to seek illumination from the gospel for their daily duty. Scientists, economics, philosophers, artists, others has to be illuminated by insights from rigorous theological thinking. For such a declericalized theology, the role of the church will be that of servant, not mistress. What that means is, it's not the professional Christians standing on stage that are going to be the most powerful and effective. It's you. It's thinking out the implications of your own faith and serving the greater good. Right now, there are 40 Redeemer people on a Gotham retreat in Princeton, in our Center for Faith and Work, 9 of whom are Redeemer West Side. That's one of the ways in which we try to inculcate this idea and help people think through the implications of their faith. We've hired a CFW director for the whole Redeemer Network who's going to be here in the spring, who's going to help us create a more robust across-the-network offerings for classes and experiences, because this is going to be critical in a post-pandemic New York City, in which people are working all kinds of different ways. They're working from home, they're disconnected, right? They're on Zoom. Like, we have to figure that out and think about that we're not just in our own bubbles, but we're being faithfully present, because this metaphor that Jesus gives of salt is so helpful, because it doesn't just help expand the flavor of the food, but in the ancient times, as many of you know, it preserved the food from corruption. And isn't that what Mordecai did? Through his faithful presence last week, he saved the king's life. And through his faithful presence in the weeks to come, we're going to see how he saves thousands of Jews from the corruption of the pride of Haman. That's what it means to be followers of Jesus in a post-pandemic world in New York City, to live out this paradigm from Jeremiah 29, to not be coercive, but not to withdraw. Now, let me just close with this. How is that possible? How do we over time, become people who are less like Haman and say, look at me, and are paralyzed by our worry and our insecurity, and more like Mordecai. And so obviously we have to say, well, how does this connect to Jesus? How do we drain the pride and increase barriers? And I was reading this week, in light of this weekend, several sermons by Dr. Martin Luther King. And he has a sermon on the Good Samaritan in which he's obviously reflecting on how the Samaritan crossed the road to love not just somebody who was a neighbor, but was his enemy, right? Samaritans and Jews. And in that sermon, he talks about, on the one hand, we need enforceable laws to change the world, right? That we need laws to say you can't discriminate in your hiring based on race or gender. We need laws to enforce that there should be desegregation in schools. That those are important things, but he says ultimately the only way we're going to get the world that we want, where the city of man becomes like the city of God, and where personally we become more like someone who's faithfully present than someone who's like Haman, is what he calls the unenforceable law of love. Something that will change us on the inside so that our motives are such that we want to cross the street, that we will go over to the Hamans in our lives and pray for them and help them. And he says, as he always does in his sermons, the ultimate example of the unenforceable love of the cosmos is Jesus Christ on the cross, who came into the world, who gave away the robe of his royalty and rode in on a different kind of horse and willingly went all the way to the cross. And that is the ultimate unenforceable law of love. And that to the degree that we can begin to see that that was done for me and for you, right? You can see that Haman actually wanted the right thing. We all need that robe. We need somebody greater than us to say, you are loved, you are honored, because the robe of the king wasn't just a formality. It was a way of saying, you are part of my family. You are part of somebody who I have affection for. You are part of me. So he had the right idea. He just went to the wrong king. And so Jesus is the king who has given you the robe of his righteousness, because he went to the cross and he became sin so that we might become the righteousness of God. See, this is the ways in which, if we can take that in and resist the ways in which we feel like I'm not like Haman, and overcome the resistance and say, I'm not worthy of that kind of love, when we can have our hearts open to both of those truths, we can become less and less like Haman, who need the approval of others, and more like agents of reconciliation, like Mordecai, and love our neighbors and heal our city. So let's pray. Father, I thank you for the truths of this story. I confess that in my own heart, I know that you have rescued me and brought me into a broad place because you delighted in me. That's what your word says. But it is so hard for us to really believe that you rescued us simply because you delight in us. We have the delight of the King of the cosmos. So help us to believe that for our sake, for our neighbor's sake, and ultimately for the glory of Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.